Hi everyone, hope you're doing well today. This video is going to serve as a kind of summary or closing comments about some of the philosophical views about the mind we've seen from this modern period. So in this video, we're going to start just by distinguishing the three views that we've seen, review the case for dualism, the case for physicalism, and the case for panpsychism. But then really what I want to do is I want to close with some discussion of the history of philosophy and its relation to contemporary philosophy, and what roles, looking back at these views and their development, can help us to understand about our contemporary perspectives. So remember, the three views that we've looked at are physicalism, which says that everything that exists is fundamentally physical, and everything about the human mind can ultimately be fully explained in terms of physical things and their behavior. The dualist view, however, says, well, physical stuff exists, but that's not enough to understand how the human mind fits into everything else. The mind is something separate. The human mind is at least partly to be understood as non-physical or immaterial. The last view, panpsychism, says that consciousness, or the mental, the mind, is itself a fundamental and ubiquitous aspect of the natural and physical world. Let's talk a little bit about panpsychism just to make sure we understand how it's different than both dualism and physicalism. Panpsychism is different than traditional versions of physicalism because both theories essentially agree that only one kind of thing exists. They agree that only physical things exist. There's no immaterial realm where the mind exists separate from the physical. These are both monistic views rather than dualist views because they think there's one kind of thing. They disagree, however, about the fundamental nature of those physical things that exist. Traditional physicalist views believe that when you get to the fundamental level, physical matter has no mind-like qualities. So at the basic level, there is no mind or consciousness or experience. Instead, traditional physicalists believe that the mind arises at a higher level, above, or is built out of that foundation. So consciousness, thought, understanding emerges at a higher level and is built by combining physical things where these physical parts don't have any mentality, but when you put them in the right kind of way, the physical things as a whole do have a mind. So think of this as an analogy with the wetness of water. So this is something that emerges at a higher level. You take the smaller components, the two hydrogen atoms and the oxygen atom. None of those have this feature of being wet. But when you combine those elements together and you get this whole molecule, this water molecule, then at that higher level of the whole, you get wetness. So you don't have wetness at the fundamental level. You put the pieces together that don't have wetness, and they are arranged in the right way so as to explain how you get wetness at the higher level. Similarly, at the fundamental level, you have all these physical things that don't have any mind or experience or consciousness, but when you put them in the right place and combine them in the right order, then at the higher level, when you take them as a group, the group has a mind or beliefs or consciousness. It's in this way that the mind can be explained in physical terms. But panpsychists reject this idea. They don't believe that you can build the mind out of these non-mental, non-conscious experiential parts. It can't emerge at the higher level in this way. So panpsychists believe that consciousness or experience is itself a fundamental aspect of the physical matter. At the very basic level, at the starting level, that physical stuff already has experience or sensation or understanding. But panpsychism is also different than dualism. Now, because both theories, both panpsychism and dualism, essentially agree that you can't explain mental phenomena by appealing to some more fundamental or basic physical non-mental stuff. But they disagree, however, about how that mental phenomena relate to the physical world. Traditional dualist views claim that the mind, conscious thought, is immaterial. It's non-physical. It's separate from the physical worlds. And traditional dualists would also claim that the mind is not ubiquitous. The fundamental elements of the physical world do not have any experience or consciousness on the dualist view. Plants, for instance, do not have any experience, consciousness, or understanding. But panpsychists do not believe that the mind exists separate from physical matter. The mind or conscious or experience is itself a feature of that physical matter. The very nature of physical matter itself already includes consciousness or experience in some way. And so because of that, panpsychists believe that consciousness or experience is also ubiquitous. It's not something that's unique just to human beings. Since consciousness or experience is a fundamental aspect of matter, all matter will thereby have some rudimentary mentality. So on this view, a plant is made of matter, and matter by its very nature has experience or a mind. So on the panpsychist view, that plant has some very simple form of experience. It's not as complex as the experience that human beings have, but there's still consciousness there in some simple rudimentary form. Even a cell, even a bacteria, even when you get down to the most basic physical phenomena like an electron, there'll be some very, very simple rudimentary kind of mental phenomena, even at that fundamental level. All right, so now that we've distinguished panpsychism from those other views, why should we believe any of those views? Well, for the case for dualism, we've seen two basic kinds of arguments. First, there's this Cartesian idea that the way we think about the mind and the living body allows us to conceive of one existing without the other. And then Descartes argues that the fact that we're able to think about the one without the other implies that, well, it's a possibility for the one to exist without the other, which would thereby imply that the mind has to be something different than the physical stuff. The Jakob and Haywatt argument goes a little bit different and says when we think about physical stuff, well, it seems to lack any kind of mentality, conscious experience, or thought. But it says no amount of information about how non-mental physical stuff is combined or how it behaves would thereby explain conscious or how thought arises. No matter how much you tell me about all the physical stuff that's going on in my brain, it doesn't explain why that brain state comes with a particular feeling. This concludes that the mind must be something non-physical and immaterial. But of course, then we've seen various worries for dualism. The worry for the Cartesian argument that we've seen is just that there's some examples that make us believe that maybe conceivability doesn't actually imply that something is possible. Lois Lane might be able to think about Superman existing without Clark Kent, but that doesn't thereby prove that it's possible for Superman to exist without Clark Kent, because as a matter of fact, they're the same person. A worry for the Jakob and Haywatt argument is just that the mere fact that we're unable to explain how the mind arises out of physical stuff, that might just be a sign of our own ignorance rather than a sign that there is no possible explanation. We've also seen the interaction problem, which is just the fact that dualism implies a kind of disunified picture of the world. We have physical stuff on one side and non-physical immaterial stuff on the other. But in our experience, it seems like the mind and body seem to interact with one another, but that disunified picture seems incapable of explaining how those two aspects of the world would be able to interact with one another as we know they do. And now this leads directly into the case in favor of physicalism. So we haven't looked at a direct case for physicalism or materialism. Thomas Hobbes, who we didn't read, was one of the main defenders of a physicalist approach at the time. However, much of what we've discussed has indirectly suggested some of the considerations in favor of physicalism. So firstly, the interaction problem that we got from Princess Elizabeth seems to be one way to argue in favor of physicalism. As we've said, in our experience, the mind and body seem to interact. I get kicked in the shin, I feel pain. I feel thirst in my mind, that gets my body to move and go to the fridge and grab a drink. Now, dualism seems incapable of explaining that interaction, but physicalism seems to have a straightforward explanation, since if the mind is just a physical thing like activity in our brain, well, to explain how that influences our body, I just have to explain how that activity in the brain interacts with another part of my body and gets it to walk. But there's no fundamental objection to the idea that some physical things might make contact with others and get other physical things to move. Now, another kind of reason in favor of physicalism is what you might call the past success of science. So this is largely a contemporary consideration, but Princess Elizabeth suggested that, well, we have a clear and distinct conception of the soul or mind as a thinking thing. Perhaps there are other aspects of the soul or mind of which we're ignorant that it could explain how the mind might also be extended or physical. Now, similarly, someone might believe that the way physical stuff accounts for the mind stems from some aspect of physical stuff that we're currently ignorant of. And now, maybe the reason we can't explain the mind in physical terms is simply because there's so much we don't know yet about the physical brain, for instance. But someone might be optimistic that as we learn more about the physical brain, we'll slowly be able to explain the mind purely in physical terms. And the evidence in favor of this today might be that if we look starting at Descartes' time, Jacob Hay-Watt, Cavendish, and we look through the history all the way up until now, we have the benefit of hindsight, and we could see that the physical sciences have been incredibly successful throughout this history. And given all that success that it's had in explaining other things, like the weather, living versus non-living things, etc., that might give us some reason to believe that as science learns more about physical things, we'll eventually be able to give a physical explanation of the mind, just like physical science has done with all these other things that were hard to explain before as well. All right, and now finally, we had to consider the case for panpsychism. So we've seen a few arguments from Cavendish. So first, she gives arguments that physical matter must be capable of experience and intelligence. She gives the argument from the interaction problem, which we've already seen. She appeals to her motion argument, this idea that the mind moves, but whatever moves, she thinks has to be a physical thing. And so if the mind moves, it has to be a physical thing. These arguments, though, give no reason to prefer panpsychism over the traditional physicalist view. So now we get to the arguments for panpsychism specifically. Firstly, we have our same matter argument. And so the idea is if our matter is capable of thinking and intelligence, and other things are made of the same matter, well, we should think that those things also are capable of intelligence and experience as well. We have our self-motion argument, this idea that motion has to be understood in terms of self-motion, that all physical matter is in motion, and thus it needs intelligence in order to direct itself into motion. And then we have the orderliness of nature of argument. The idea is when you look at the physical world, there seems to be a kind of orderliness to it. Well, how does it get put into these orderly systems? Well, the idea is it would have to put itself, it would have to have some sort of intelligence to put itself into this orderly organization. Contemporary panpsychist arguments tend to argue in its favor by saying that it provides a kind of middle ground between the excesses of dualism, so it avoids this disunified or disjointed picture of reality, since unlike dualism, panpsychist is monist in nature. But they think it also avoids the excesses of physicalism, because the worry there is that physicalism just can't explain how consciousness arises. And so the panpsychist takes consciousness as fundamental to the physical world itself. I want to end by discussing this idea that by reviewing this debate from the modern period, it can help us better appreciate the way in which our contemporary discussions and views might be a result of a kind of historical contingency. So when you look at the philosophy of mind for the past 100 years, one thing you might notice is during the 1950s and 80s, it looked like physicalist views of the mind had largely won the debate among both scientists and philosophers. And a lot of this was largely not because of any specific argument that anybody gave. It was just that philosophers and scientists were impressed by the advances of science and they wanted to be scientifically rigorous. And a lot of people associate physicalist approaches to the mind with being a scientific view of the mind. And so that association largely pushed people towards defending physicalist views. But then, by the mid-1990s and early 2000s, philosophers started to stress some of these potential limits of those physical approaches. And because of that, dualism started to see a resurgence during that time. But a lot of philosophers still remained skeptical because dualism still had all those difficulties that Descartes and others encountered during his time, and people didn't really have any solution to those. And then you look at panpsychism, though, and that view had died out long ago. However, about 10 to 15 years ago, philosophers and scientists started to take some of those panpsychist ideas a bit more seriously. And they thought that it might actually provide us a potential way to find a middle ground between physicalist and dualist ideas. But now, even in this debate, even now, there's recently even been a scandal where a small group of scientists and philosophers published a letter denouncing a recent scientific theory of consciousness, one of what was thought of as one of like three of the leading theories that a number of scientists and philosophers have defended. These scientists came out describing this theory as pseudoscience, as not really science, largely because they thought that this scientific theory had implications that had a panpsychist nature. And so their worries with panpsychism led them to say that this theory isn't really a scientific theory of consciousness, it's just pseudoscience. And I think when you look at this history, what this shows is about our contemporary perspective and the contemporary assumptions we make for trying to understand the world that influence our current worldview and maybe dominate discussion amongst scientists and philosophers. Oftentimes, that's not because of any specific argument. Rather, it just has to do with the fact that certain views died out for purely contingent reasons. They just fell by the wayside, not due to any argument, but just due to the way the history developed. And that suggests to us that we should question our current assumptions about our worldviews. And by looking at the history of people that weren't in this contemporary discussion, we can better see alternative viewpoints that might have been lost to history and see how those views maybe could offer an alternative to the way that we think about things now. All right, so that's all for this video. See y'all next time. Bye-bye.